The cage was too small for a man to stand in. That was the first thing. Not the town, not the dust, not the 6 men leaning against it like it was a fence post at a cattle auction. The cage. It was iron, bolted together from what looked like old mine rail, and it sat on a wooden platform in the dead center of the main street, with a man inside it who had one arm and nowhere to put it except through the bars. His other sleeve was pinned at the shoulder, empty, and the way it hung there in the heat told a story that started with a battlefield and ended here, in a cage, in a town whose name the stranger didn't know yet. The sign nailed to the platform said $500. Scout didn't stop at the edge of town this time. The horse walked straight down the main street without being told, which meant the horse was angry. Scout got angry about twice a year. The stranger had learned to pay attention when it happened because the horse was usually right about what deserved anger and what didn't, and a one-armed man in a cage in the middle of a street deserved it. The man in the cage saw him coming. He had the kind of face that war builds, all planes and edges with the soft parts burned away by things no man should have to see at 19 and carry for the rest of his life. He was maybe 50 now. The war had been 20 years ago, but it was still living in the lines around his eyes, and the way he held his one remaining hand, half closed, like it was always ready to grip something. A rifle, a saddle horn, a bar on a cage that some men had locked him inside because he owed $500 he didn't have. 6 men. The stranger counted them without moving his eyes. 2 sitting on barrels to the left of the cage, 2 leaning on the platform to the right. One sitting on top of the cage itself, his boots dangling above the veteran's head, using the man beneath him as furniture. And one standing apart from the others, arms crossed, watching the street with the particular attention of a man who gets paid to watch streets. The watcher was the one in charge. The stranger could tell by the distance. Men in charge always stand slightly apart from the men they command, because proximity implies equality, and men in charge don't want to imply equality. He was tall, broad, wearing a long coat despite the heat, which meant he had weapons underneath it that he didn't want seen until they were needed. The stranger dismounted in front of the cage. He didn't tie Scout. The horse would stay. The horse would also leave if the stranger needed him to leave, and right now the stranger wanted the option. He looked at the man in the cage. The veteran looked back. Neither of them spoke. There's a thing that happens between men who have both seen the worst of what people do to each other, a recognition that doesn't need words, a nod that happens behind the eyes instead of with the head. It happened now. The stranger read the sign, $500. Then he looked at the watcher. "What's this?" the stranger said. "That's Jonas Welch, lost his arm at Shiloh and his money at cards and his ranch to Mr. Bartlett about 3 months ago. Owes $500 on a note he can't pay. Mr. Bartlett figured public encouragement might help him find the funds." The watcher's voice was flat, the voice of a man who had stopped thinking about whether what he did was right a long time ago. "You're welcome to contribute, otherwise ride on." "Shiloh," the stranger said. "What about it?" "He lost his arm at Shiloh. That means he was 19 or 20 years old standing in a peach orchard while 20,000 men tried to kill each other over a church called Shiloh Meeting House. He survived that, walked home with one arm, built a life, and now he's in a cage because a man named Bartlett says he owes $500. That's a real touching history lesson. The debt is the debt. Cage stays until it's paid." The stranger looked at Jonas Welch. "Is the debt real?" Jonas spoke for the first time. His voice was the voice of a man who'd been in an iron box in the sun for long enough that his throat had turned to leather. "I had a ranch. 14 years I built it. Good land, good water, 200 head. My wife Catherine died 2 years ago. After she died, I took a loan from the bank to keep things running because ranching with one arm takes hired help, and hired help costs money. I made every payment, every single one. Then Bartlett bought the bank 8 months ago, and suddenly my terms changed. Interest doubled. Payment schedule moved up. I couldn't keep pace. He called the note, took the ranch, and said I still owed $500 on top of it. I don't owe that money. The original terms didn't include it. But the original terms are gone because Bartlett's man rewrote them. Who rewrote them? Clerk named Sweeney. Works out of the back of the bank. He's the one who does the paper. Changes terms, adjusts numbers, makes the old documents disappear and new ones show up with different figures. Sweeney's been doing it for every rancher Bartlett has taken. I'm not the first. I'm the 7th. The man sitting on top of the cage knocked his boot against the bars above Jonas's head. "Shut up, Welch." Jonas didn't shut up. He looked at the stranger with eyes that had watched men die in a peach orchard, and had decided 20 years ago that there were things worth talking about even when someone tells you to stop. "My wife kept the originals. Catherine was a school teacher before we married. She kept everything. Every letter from the bank, every payment receipt, every version of the loan terms. She filed them in a wooden box in the root cellar, organized by date, with notes in the margins explaining what each document meant. She did that because she said someday someone would try to take what we built, and when they did, the paper would matter more than the guns. Smart woman. Smartest person I ever knew. I'm a man who couldn't read until she taught me. I lost my arm at 20, and I thought my life was over. And then I met a woman who looked at me like the arm didn't matter. And she was right. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the work and the land and her. His voice went somewhere else for a moment, somewhere the cage couldn't reach. She's buried on that ranch, under the cottonwood by the creek. I built the marker myself, one-handed. Took me 3 days. It's not straight, but it's there. The stranger turned to the watcher. Open the cage. Not happening. I wasn't asking your permission. I was telling you what's about to happen. The watcher uncrossed his arms. The coat shifted and the stranger saw what was underneath. 2 pistols, cross-draw rig, well-worn grips. The man wasn't just a watcher. He was a shooter. The stranger filed that information where he filed all such information, in the place behind his thoughts where calculations happen without conscious effort. Mister, the watcher said, Cole Bartlett owns this town. I work for Cole Bartlett. These 5 men work for Cole Bartlett. The sheriff works for Cole Bartlett. The bank, the saloon, the livery, the freight office, all of it works for Cole Bartlett. You are one man with one gun standing in a town that belongs to someone else. Think about that. I've thought about it. The stranger looked at the cage, at the lock. Heavy iron, keyed, the kind they use on mine gates. Who has the key? I do. The watcher patted his coat pocket, and it stays where it is. A door opened down the street. The stranger heard it but didn't turn. He'd been waiting for it. There was always a door. In every town, in every story like this, there was always someone behind a door who had been waiting for a reason to open it. That man served his country. The voice was deep and rough, and it came from the porch of the feed store, where a man built like a blacksmith stood with his fists at his sides. He was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, and walking was clearly difficult, both legs stiff at the knee. Another veteran. Jonas Welch carried 2 wounded men off the field at Shiloh with one arm, because the other one was already gone. He carried them a 1/4 mile to the field hospital, and then he went back for a 3rd. I know because I was the 3rd. He stepped off the porch. My name is Holt Brannigan. I've been in this town for 6 years, and I've watched Bartlett take everything from everyone, and I'm done watching. Another door opened. An old woman, then another. A young man from the livery, then 2 more from a building down the street. The town was cracking open the way frozen ground cracks in spring, slow at first, and then all at once. Holt walked to the cage and stood beside the stranger. He looked at the watcher. I was at Shiloh too. Right flank, 6th Iowa. I know what Jonas did that day. I know what it cost him. And I know what that cage is. That cage is what happens when men forget that some debts aren't about money. The watcher looked at his men. The math was shifting. 6 armed men against a stranger is arithmetic. 6 armed men against a stranger in a town is a different kind of problem, the kind that doesn't solve cleanly. The stranger used the moment. He pulled his knife, jammed it into the gap between the lock plate and the cage frame, and leveraged. The lock was strong, but the cage was built from mine rail, not prison iron, and the bolts holding the plate were rusted. The plate popped. The door swung open. Jonas Welch crawled out. He couldn't stand immediately. His legs had been folded under him for too long. Holt Brannigan reached down with his 7-fingered hand and pulled Jonas to his feet, and the 2 men stood in the middle of the street holding each other up. 2 broken soldiers, 20 years removed from the worst day of their lives, still carrying each other off the field. The stranger let that image settle into the town. He let every face and every window see it. Then he turned to the watcher. I'm going to need about 4 hours. Tell Bartlett whatever you want. Tell him a stranger freed his prisoner, and the stranger is still in town, and the stranger isn't leaving until this is finished. Tell him I said he has until midnight to decide how this ends. The watcher looked at the open cage, at Jonas standing, at Holt beside him, at the 11 townspeople now visible on the street. He made a decision that the stranger could read on his face before the man even moved. He wasn't going to fight. Not now. Not with witnesses. He turned and walked toward the saloon with his 5 men behind him, and the stranger watched them go and counted their steps, because the rhythm of a man's walk tells you whether he's retreating or repositioning, and this man was repositioning. He had 4 hours, maybe less. He took Jonas to the feed store where Holt had a room in the back. Holt's wife, a solid woman named May, who moved like someone who'd spent her life compensating for a husband whose body didn't work the way it used to, brought water and bread and cleaned the marks the cage bars had left on Jonas's arms and legs. Tell me about Catherine's box, the stranger said. Jonas ate slowly, his one hand managing the bread with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been doing everything one-handed for 20 years. Root cellar, north wall, third stone from the floor, the one with the crack in it. You pull the stone and there's a space behind it. Catherine hollowed it out herself with a chisel. The box is in there. Bartlett's men searched the house? Twice. Pulled up floorboards, emptied closets, turned the place inside out. They were looking for cash. They didn't think to look for paper. A thin smile. Catherine always said that men who steal with paper never think to look for paper. They assume everyone hides money because that's what they'd hide. The stranger looked at Holt. What do you know about Sweeney? Holt leaned forward. Sweeney's the spine of the whole operation. Without Sweeney's pen, Bartlett's just a man with money and opinions. Sweeney rewrites every loan, every term, every agreement. He keeps the originals in a locked drawer in the back office of the bank, and he keeps copies in his boarding room above the general store. The man's meticulous. He keeps 2 sets of everything because he knows that if Bartlett ever turns on him, the copies are his insurance. 2 sets. The originals showing what the real terms were, and the rewrites showing what Bartlett told him to change them to, side by side, in the same drawer. Holt shook his head. Sweeney's not evil, he's scared. Bartlett brought him in from Kansas City with a salary and a promise, and by the time Sweeney understood what the job actually was, he was in too deep to walk away. May spoke from the corner where she was wringing out a cloth. Sweeney comes to the feed store every Thursday for grain. He buys the same order every week. Last month he lingered. Didn't say anything specific, but he stood at the counter for 10 minutes after he paid, looking at the door like he was trying to decide whether to walk through it or say something. Then he left. She paused. A man who lingers like that is a man looking for an exit. At 5 o'clock, the stranger rode to the Welch Ranch. Good land. The kind that explains why men steal it. 200 acres of grass and water with a creek that ran cold even in August, and a cottonwood tree by the bank that was old enough to have seen the whole territory change hands twice. Catherine's marker was under it. The stranger stood beside it for a moment. The marker was crooked, built by one hand, and the letters were rough cut but readable. Catherine Welch. She made everything better. He found the root cellar, third stone from the floor. The space behind it held a wooden box with brass corners and a latch that was stiff from disuse. Inside, everything Jonas described. The original loan terms, signed by Jonas and the previous bank owner, with an interest rate and payment schedule that were nothing like what Bartlett had imposed. Every payment receipt, organized by date, with Catherine's handwritten notes in the margins. Paid on time, Jonas proud. Early payment this month, good year for cattle. Bank acknowledged receipt, filed copy. A schoolteacher's precision applied to a rancher's finances, every detail preserved because Catherine Welch understood that the truth is only as strong as the paper it's written on. He cross-referenced the originals with Jonas's account of what Bartlett had changed. The interest had been doubled. The payment schedule moved from quarterly to monthly. A balloon clause had been added that didn't exist in the original, and the $500 Jonas supposedly owed was a fabricated penalty for a late payment that Catherine's receipts proved was made on time. The whole case was built on paper Sweeney had rewritten. Remove Sweeney's rewrites and Bartlett had nothing. He rode back to town. At 7 o'clock he went to the general store and waited on the stairs that led to the boarding rooms above. Sweeney came home at 7:30. Thin man, wire spectacles, ink permanently embedded in the creases of his fingers. He saw the stranger and stopped. I know what you did at the cage, Sweeney said. I know what you do at the bank. Sweeney stood on the stairs for a long time. The stranger could see the war happening behind his eyes. Fear of Bartlett against fear of everything Bartlett had made him do. Self-preservation against something older and harder to name that might have been conscience. I keep copies, Sweeney said finally, of everything. The originals and the rewrites, side by side. 7 ranchers, 7 sets of documents showing exactly what was changed and when. I know, I need them. If I give them to you, Bartlett will destroy me. Bartlett's going to be destroyed. You can go down with him, or you can hand the territorial marshal 7 sets of evidence and be the witness who broke the case. One of those ends with prison, the other doesn't. Sweeney went into his room. He came out with a leather satchel, heavy. He handed it to the stranger without looking at it. I've been carrying that bag to the boarding room every night for 8 months. Every night I thought about burning it. Every night I put it back under the bed. He paused. Tell Jonas I'm sorry. Tell him the original terms were fair. Tell him his wife was right to keep the receipts. At 8 o'clock, the stranger sent 3 telegrams. Federal Land Office, Territorial Marshal, County bank examiner. The third was the one that mattered most. 7 falsified loan documents, 7 rewritten terms, 7 ranchers dispossessed through fraud. When the examiner matched the originals against the rewrites, the whole operation collapsed backward through every transaction Bartlett had ever made. At 10 o'clock, he walked into the saloon. Bartlett was in a booth at the back. He was a thick man with a prosperous gut and the calm of someone who had never been in the cage, always on the outside of it, always holding the key. The watcher stood behind him. The 5 other men were spread around the room. The stranger set everything on the table: Catherine's receipts, the original loan terms, Sweeney's satchel, open, 7 sets of documents visible inside, and the $500 sign from the cage, which he'd pulled off the platform on his way to the saloon. 7 ranchers, the stranger said, 7 loans rewritten, 7 sets of terms falsified. Your clerk kept copies of everything, the originals and the forgeries, side by side. Catherine Welch kept every receipt for every payment her husband made, with notes in the margins in her own handwriting. 3 telegrams went out tonight. The bank examiner is going to match the originals against the rewrites, and every transaction you've made in this town becomes evidence of federal bank fraud. Bartlett looked at the satchel. His face didn't change, but his hands went flat on the table, which told the stranger everything. Sweeney gave you those, Bartlett said. Sweeney wants to sleep at night, something you haven't let him do in 8 months. The watcher shifted behind Bartlett. The stranger looked at him directly. You've done this math before. Federal bank fraud, 7 counts, conspiracy. Whatever he pays you, double it in your head and ask yourself if that number covers 20 years in a federal prison. Because that's the sentence. The watcher reached into his coat pocket. The room tensed. He pulled out the cage key and set it on the table. Then he unbuttoned the coat, took off the cross-draw rig, and laid it beside the key. I'm done, he said. Not to Bartlett, to the room. He walked out. His men followed. Not all at once this time. In ones, over the next 30 minutes, each one making the same calculation and reaching the same answer. By 11, the saloon was empty except for Bartlett and the bartender and the stranger and the weight of 7 families' worth of stolen paper sitting on the table. You put a man in a cage, the stranger said. A man who lost his arm carrying wounded soldiers off a battlefield when he was 20 years old. A man who built a ranch with one hand and buried his wife under a cottonwood tree and carved her marker himself because nobody else was going to do it. You put that man in an iron box in the sun and nailed a price tag to it. He paused. The marshal will be here inside the week. I'd start writing tonight. Bartlett left. He didn't speak. He didn't finish his drink. He walked out into a street that was lined with people who had come out of their homes for the second time that day, and he walked past them without looking, and the stranger heard a horse leave town heading west, and the sound faded and was gone. He walked to the feed store. Jonas was sitting in a chair on the porch with Holt beside him. May had brought them both coffee, and the 2 men sat in the dark drinking it. 2 soldiers who had found each other 20 years after the field, and were still, after everything, holding each other up. It's done, the stranger said. Your original terms are intact. Catherine's receipts prove every payment. The marshal will need her box and Sweeney's documents. Jonas looked at his one hand wrapped around the coffee cup. Catherine used to put her hand over mine when we sat on the porch at night. She'd cover my hand with hers and hold it against the arm of the chair and say, "This is enough," meaning the hand, meaning one was enough, meaning I was enough. He cleared his throat. I'm going to go home tomorrow. I'm going to sit under that cottonwood and put my hand on her marker and tell her she was right. The paper mattered. The paper saved us. Holt put his 7-fingered hand on Jonas's shoulder. Jonas reached up with his one hand and gripped it. 2 men, 5 fingers between them on that grip. Enough. The stranger left before dawn. Scout was pointed north, waiting with the patience of an animal who understood that the road was the only home they had and the only one they needed. Behind him, Jasper was quiet. Not the quiet of fear. The quiet that comes after a cage is opened and a man stands up, and the town that watched him suffer finally watches him walk free. He thought about Jonas in the cage, about the empty sleeve pinned at the shoulder, and the one hand gripping the bars and the voice that said Catherine's name like it was the only prayer he knew. He thought about Holt pulling him to his feet with a hand that was missing 3 fingers, 2 broken men carrying each other off another field. He thought about Sweeney standing on the stairs with 8 months of evidence in a bag he'd carried home every night, and never burned because somewhere under the fear, there was still something that knew the difference. He thought about Catherine's marker under the cottonwood. She made everything better. And in the margins of every receipt, in a schoolteacher's careful hand, The words that proved it. Paid on time, Jonas proud. Scout settled into that easy trot that covered miles without announcing them. North. The sky was pale and wide, and the road was empty, and the only sound was hooves on dirt, and the quiet breathing of a horse who was no longer angry, because the thing that deserved anger had been fixed. If this is where you found him, if Jasper is your first ride, the beginning is waiting. Both stories are in the description. Watch them. Come back. Tell me one thing in the comments. Which moment stayed with you? 2 words. That's all. And if you want to know where the trail goes next, subscribe. New stories every week. I'll see you on the road.